Good evening. Thank you for being with us. This is our current affairs program in English every Friday. The topic today is the controversial deal that was made at the beginning of the Labour administration with Vitals Global and now Steward Healthcare. My guests in the studio are Dr. Edward Debono and Dr. Joe Giglio. I thank Dr. Giglio because he's done this topic with me quite a few times. Thank you both for coming. Thank you. There's been new developments over the last few weeks. Would we be able to talk through them, the most recent developments?
The most recent development is the National Audit Report, which has been issued 2 or 3 days ago, where it has been found that Konrad Mizzi, the minister involved in clinching the deal with Vitals, was in collusion with Vitals, that is Tam Tumuluri, and he did a deal which was bound to fail and which, according to the financials presented by the Evaluation and Adjudication Committee, it was impossible that this deal would actually sail through. So obviously, this was a deal which was bound to fail, where there is a stench of corruption and where government has no alternative now but to ensure that this deal is totally annulled, not only waiting for a court decision, because the leader of the opposition has filed a court case against government, against the Prime Minister, at the time Joseph Muscat, and against the Lands Authority, asking them to get back and give back the Maltese people the property which they have given or granted on temporary emphyteuses for a period of 30 years, to be extended for another 30 years and for another 30 years, in total 90 years of prime property, the promontory where there's St. Luke's Hospital, Karen Gregg Hospital in particular.
And the Gozo Hospital, right?
And the Gozo Hospital was part of the deal, but I'm not quite sure whether the land of the Gozo Hospital was actually transferred to the consortium. What has been transferred on temporary emphyteuses is definitely the promontory in Guardamanja, where the St. Luke's Hospital and Karen Gregg Hospital, which is prime land, which is worth hundreds of millions of euros in today's currency. And these people, and this Ram Tumuluri, who, by the way, had been adjudged a bankrupt in 2012 by the Canadian courts, was called in by the Maltese government to actually manage these hospitals, and he had no iota of learning in actually managing a hospital.
So there was no track record?
Not only there was no track record, the only thing he managed was an Ayurveda clinic in India, and it collapsed as well. But medical hospitals, absolutely no expertise.
And may we point out, perhaps at this stage, that there was no due diligence. The contract was awarded, or the memorandum of the agreement was.
Yes. That was a shambles.
Yes.
That was. It has been found out that before the Evaluation and Adjudication Committee came into it, which was headed by the CEO of Projects Malta, Mr. James Kamenzuli, this deal was already clinched by government. And they didn't do any investigation, not only as to the background of this Mr. Ram Tumuluri, but also as to the financials. They rested on a letter of comfort by the Bank of India and for technical expertise by another Indian company, which was a construction company in India, but where no deal had actually yet been clinched between Ram Tumuluri and the consortium.
So am I getting this right, that it was done with intention, that this company with no track record is awarded a contract of this size?
Yes, and we know the result, because what happened was that as soon as they started operating, although there had to be an investment of 178 million euros, this money never came true. And government, the Maltese government, had to guarantee a loan granted by Bank of Valletta to Vitals of 30 million. In the meantime, government was paying Ram Tumuluri Vitals every year 70 million euros. Presently, he is paying 90 million euros. And now, our corrupt Mr. Muscat, ex-Prime Minister of Malta, has gone to the incumbent Prime Minister Abela, and asked him that government should now pay stewards 120 million a year. Why are we paying this money to this consortium when they have not produced anything in the deal? They were supposed to give us 80 beds for tourism in St. Luke's Hospital and refurbish the whole hospital for us. They had to give us beds in Karen Gregg Hospital and refurbish the hospital. They had to build a medical school both in Malta and in Gozo. They had also to build the Gozo and refurbish the Gozo Hospital. Out of this, they have done nothing. The only thing which is up and running is the Barts Hospital in Gozo, but I think there are only about 12 students, international students, who are actually following the course in Gozo.
Dr. Giglio, when did all this start? I mean, so how many years have passed and we're still without what has been promised?
Well, I think this started way back in 2015, if I remember correctly, and we have reached the stage that we have reached today, Leah, which is the stage that Edward has so aptly pointed out. I would like to also now start discussing what we're going to do after this. I think everybody on this island now can understand that this hospital contract was a mess, and that we have to now start thinking as to what we're going to do.
I mean, from what I'm seeing in the press this week, everything's being pinpointed to former Minister Konrad Mizzi. Do you believe that the rest of the cabinet were unaware of all these proceedings?
I don't really know how to answer that, Leah, to be honest. And if you ask me the honest truth, as a Maltese citizen, what really worries me most is that from our taxes, everybody is ending up spending 90 million euros a year, which, as Dr. Debono correctly pointed out, are really going money down the drain. Prime land has been taken. That is prime land which we have over there.
And a listed building also, right?
And that is prime land which can serve us and which is very relevant to us as a country in order for us to now think about how we are going to create our health system after Vitals. I think it is clear that this project is a project that has failed, but now what are we going to do? Where are we going to be taking our health sector? The idea, Leah, as an idea of having this public-private partnership insofar as health is concerned is a good idea. Unfortunately, it was the way how the idea was implemented that was manifestly incorrect and not to the best interests of our nation. But now we have to also start thinking and deciding what we are going to do.
Yes, absolutely.
Where shall we be taking our health sector? As you know, Leah, we have Barts over here, which was a good idea. Unfortunately, this issue has been tainted with these horrible stories.
Yes, yes.
But we have so many medical students, Leah, who go to study abroad. Locals who go to study abroad. what are we going to do with these and how are we going to try to, these medical students who study abroad, incentivize them to come back to Malta. As
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
most of our medical students go to study abroad and then find it very difficult to come back and work in Malta.
Yes.
They don't feel they are appreciated enough. Why don't we start appreciating them a bit more and therefore having these students coming back to Malta? Nurses, our course on nurses, how can we improve it? How can we use the idea, which was a good idea, of BARTs and also make it viable for our medical and Maltese students, for our nurses who wish to become nurses? There's so much more there that we should
There's
be
so much more.
discussing, actually. We should be discussing now what is going to happen after this is over.
Absolutely.
Everybody now has understood that this was a
Absolutely.
mess.
Absolutely. The
Medical tourism,
reason-
Leah, you ask me one last point. Medical tourism was a great idea. What unfortunately this government has done, he has ruined it in the way that he has ruined it because of the bad deal that was made. But medical tourism is important for the future of our country. Medical tourism is a great source of income which can actually help us finance our health sector. We need to push further in order to ensure that Malta becomes a center of excellence insofar as medical tourism is concerned.
And
The
there
people
were-
out there now know that Vital is a mess. Everybody accepts that Vital is a mess. And if somebody does not accept that Vital is a mess, it means that he just doesn't want to listen or doesn't want to hear.
What you're saying makes a lot of sense because, I mean, our medical profession are sought after by a lot of people all around the world.
And not only that, if I would like to just interject a bit, throughout our history, since Florence Nightingale,
Since the night. And
yes, but since Florence Nightingale, Malta was considered as the nurse of the Mediterranean.
Yes.
After the Gallipoli expedition, a lot of soldiers used to come here to get the medical treatment. So, actually taking care of people who need medical care is part of our setup. We know it.
This is a beautiful point that Edward is making. This is a beautiful point as to how we can sell our country and therefore increase our economy and get more money when we consider that historically the persons who have actually given so much to Malta, the Knights of St. John, were the hospitaliers
Yes.
who used to give medical treatment to the pilgrims who used to go to fight in Jerusalem.
It makes a lot of
Our
sense.
history makes us a history where we are known as being the best nurses of the world.
Yes.
Let's discuss Vitals as much as you wish, but let's start discussing how our health sector can be part of improving our economy, of creating new jobs, of enhancing public-private partnerships, even within the health department.
Thank you. Thank you. We're joined now by Professor Nikos Passas, who's of Greek origin but based in Boston in the USA. He's a criminal lawyer and his specialty is criminal justice and anti-corruption. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us again this week.
Thank you so much. Good evening to you.
Thank you. Good evening. We spoke last week about corruption and how to repatriate funds that have been used for corrupt purposes back to base. And the reason I wished you to join today is to speak about the hospitals, state-owned entities that now are in the hands of other people. How does one, in your experience, acquire these hospitals back and also the funds that were perhaps allegedly misused?
Well, there are many things in your question. The first one on the asset tracing, there are investigative techniques and ways of tracking down the funds and seeking repatriation and reparation of damages. It is also important to have accountability for those issues that are mentioned and were found in the report you mentioned, so that the red flags that were ignored by people and by institutions that are supposed to keep an eye on state-owned and important public policy institutions, private or public, in the country. When it comes to state-owned enterprises, there are different models in which things can come under the control of the state or move away from the control of the state. And these include either legislative acts or administrative decisions for a set period of time or for a longer period of time. And there are mixed models. And there are good practices that need to be followed. The public interest has to be served by this, and rationale has to be articulated why this or the other option is taken and how it is conducted. So then what you have is to ensure that there is proper management, oversight, and transparency on how things are managed. What we were discussing last week and today brings us to a combination of public health, especially important in the middle of a pandemic, governance, and economic issues. And all of these throw a negative light on Malta with respect to anti-corruption and financial vigilance. And it seems to me that over-politicization of these things needs to be transcended, and either a multi or non-partisan way has to be found internally, or with the assistance of something external, an international body or committee or expert group that is going to establish the facts, meet and seek the advice and insights of all stakeholders for Malta, and make some recommendations, some things that need to be done, because it seems to me to be a high priority for Malta to show a genuine desire to do something about all these things, or face very negative financial, economic consequences, as well as the brain drain that you mentioned.
Absolutely. For those viewers who weren't with us last week, we spoke about repatriating funds that have been used inappropriately. Can we just go through it very briefly today?
Well, we were talking about the repatriation of the asset recovery principle, which is critical. It's a fundamental principle of the UN Convention Against Corruption. And there you have the blueprint of criminal as well as civil procedures that can be followed through mutual assistance, investigative techniques, and all kinds of other instruments in order to ensure that victims of corrupt practices are made whole. And when the state is the victim, then the funds are returned to the treasury. So there are all kinds of both criminal and civil procedures to be followed. The process is expensive and laborious, and sometimes it takes long periods of time in order to come to fruition. But new technologies and new ways of investigating this kind of misconduct have become available and can be put to good use in order to address at the same time all these things at once. And both financial vigilance and good governance with respect to the health sector, but more broadly, public-private relations, to me, seems to be a high priority for Malta at this junction.
Thank you very much, Professor Passas. Thank you very much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Thank you. That was Professor Passas, who's an anti-corruption specialist and a specialist in criminal justice. What are your comments, Dr. Debono? Having heard, a specialist from abroad who's got no vested interest in partisan politics.
I am sorry for this nation, this noble nation. When we were colonized by the British, Lord Strickland in the British Parliament had stated that the Maltese started reading Latin before our colonizers. Our history has produced people of letters, of integrity, throughout the years. Unfortunately, during these past 7 years, this nobility of thought, of action, has been set back because there are few individuals at the top, at the helm of our government, who instead of acting in the interest of the common good, decided to enrich themselves at the expense of the public. This deal is one of them. And if there was no intent at the beginning, which I doubt, because I'm pretty sure that, as the Auditor General stated, there was collusion, there was definitely criminal intent at the end of this whole debacle. Why? How can anyone who is serious explain to a decent, rational man that after the leader of the opposition filed an action to bring back the hospitals to the Maltese people, because it was evident that this contract was made to fail from the beginning, as now has been proved by the Auditor General, Conrad Mitzi goes behind the back, supposedly, of all the other ministers to sign a side letter of 100 million euros to be given to stewards in the event that this deal is annulled or rescinded by our courts. Is it possible that the Minister of Finance, Edward Cicluna, and the cabinet of corrupt, I say, Joseph Muscat, did not know that this side letter was going to be signed? It's very simple for the people to understand. If you and your husband, or I and my wife, go to buy a house or take a loan, I can't do it on my own. I have to have my wife's signature. Is it possible that one minister, without cabinet approval, can sign 100 million when this minister is not the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Economic Affairs? This is why Conrad Mitzi is implicating the whole cabinet and asking the incumbent Prime Minister to publish the MOU that was approved by all the cabinet. If all the cabinet has signed or approved this deal, they are collectively, criminally responsible for the rape of our country.
Thank you. Very briefly, Dr. Giglio, because we're stopping for a short commercial
Very
break.
briefly, I would, of course, this is, as Dr. Debono has said, all very sad. Your distinguished guest has explained to us the issue of repatriation and proceeds of funds. Let us try to at least look at the positive side to something, to all this. And the positive side is, Leah, that in truth, Malta as a country does have the legislative framework which your guest has explained. As members of the Council of Europe, Malta is a signatory to the conventions that he is explaining, the mutual assistance in criminal matters, the Palermo Convention against corruption, the United Nations Convention on transnational organized crime. We are parties to these. So the legislative framework, and this is the positive side to it, exists. As a country, we were intelligent enough to create a legislative framework to be able to do what he is telling us.
So it's
Now what we need is the will to do it, the desire to do it, and therefore, with the will and the desire, the manpower, because this requires, as I said, it's a very laborious task, the laborious task and stuffing up our establishments to actually get things going. But first you have to have the political will to do it.
Absolutely.
The legislative framework is there.
Is there in place. Thank you very much. Thank you. I am with Dr. Edward Debono, Dr. Joe Giglio. We're having a small commercial break. We'll be with you very soon.